Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching the crimson sun rise over the Pacific on June 4, 1942. The salt spray and morning mist could not dampen his confidence as he gazed upon the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. 4 magnificent aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, rode the swells in perfect formation, their flight decks bristling with Zero fighters and dive bombers. This was the same fleet that had humiliated the Americans at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and now it would deliver the decisive blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace. Yet beneath the veneer of supremacy, warning signs flickered like storm clouds on the horizon. Intelligence reports had grown increasingly erratic. Radio intercepts suggested American forces were moving with unusual purpose. Most troubling of all, the Americans seemed to know too much about Japanese intentions. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, dismissed these concerns with the wave of a gloved hand during the final planning sessions aboard his flagship Yamato. "The Americans are scattered and demoralized," Yamamoto had declared to his staff just days before. "Our victory at Pearl Harbor proved their weakness. They cannot match our fighting spirit or tactical superiority." The assembled officers nodded in agreement, their confidence bolstered by an unbroken string of victories across the Pacific. They had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines with startling ease. Why should Midway be different? Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, harbored private doubts. During the voyage toward Midway, he had studied reconnaissance photographs and radio intelligence with growing unease. The Americans were behaving differently, more aggressively, more purposefully. Their patrol patterns suggested they were hunting, not merely defending. But when he approached Nagumo with his concerns, the admiral brushed them aside. "Genda-san, you worry too much," Nagumo replied, adjusting his binoculars. "Our pilots are the finest in the world. Our planes are superior. Our tactics are proven. What can 3 American carriers do against 4 Japanese carriers? Mathematics alone guarantees our victory." According to the Imperial War Museums, this overconfidence would prove fatal, as the combination of decision-making during the battle and the preceding months led to the U.S. Navy defeating the Japanese naval force. The first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from the carriers at dawn, their engines roaring like thunder as they disappeared into the western sky toward Midway Atoll. 108 planes, bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, carried death toward the tiny American outpost. Nagumo watched them go with satisfaction, already planning the next phase of the operation. But as the morning progressed, disturbing reports began filtering back from the strike force. The Americans were fighting with unexpected ferocity. Anti-aircraft fire was heavier than anticipated. Most puzzling of all, American aircraft seemed to be converging on the Japanese fleet from multiple directions, as if they knew exactly where to find them. At 7:55 that morning, the first electric shock of realization struck the Japanese fleet. A reconnaissance plane from the cruiser Tone reported spotting American ships northeast of Midway. Then came the words that would haunt Nagumo for the rest of his life. "Enemy fleet sighted. 10 ships, including 1 carrier." The Americans were not cowering in Pearl Harbor as expected. They were here, positioned perfectly for battle, waiting with predatory patience. For a moment, the certainty that had carried the Japanese across thousands of miles of ocean wavered like heat shimmer above hot steel. But it was too late for second thoughts. The dice had been cast, the planes were already in the air, and the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War was about to begin. The message crackled through the radio aboard Akagi at 8:09 that morning. "Enemy fleet includes what appears to be a carrier." Admiral Nagumo felt his stomach tighten as he processed the implications. His carefully orchestrated plan, designed to lure out and destroy American carriers, had backfired spectacularly. The hunters had become the hunted. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Nagumo's chief of staff, rushed to the bridge with updated intelligence reports. "Sir, we have confirmation of at least one American carrier, possibly more, positioned northeast of our formation. They appear to be launching aircraft." The bridge fell silent except for the steady thrumming of Akagi's engines and the distant roar of combat air patrol Zeros circling overhead. Nagumo faced an agonizing decision that would determine the fate of the Imperial Navy. On Akagi's hangar deck below, maintenance crews were frantically rearming the second wave of aircraft. These planes had been loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking American ships. But when the first strike force reported that Midway's airfield required another attack, Nagumo had ordered them rearmed with high-explosive bombs for land targets. "Sir, what are your orders?" Commander Genda asked, his voice tight with tension. Around them, the organized chaos of a carrier at war continued. Pilots sprinting to ready rooms, mechanics hauling ammunition, signalmen flashing messages between ships. But on the bridge, time seemed suspended as Nagumo wrestled with a decision that would echo through history. The admiral's weathered face showed the strain of command as he calculated odds and possibilities. His first wave would not return from Midway for at least an hour. His second wave was half-armed with the wrong ordnance. American planes were already in the air, racing toward his fleet. Every minute of delay brought disaster closer, yet launching half-prepared aircraft could prove equally catastrophic. "Continue rearming operations," Nagumo finally ordered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We cannot attack with inadequate preparation. When our aircraft return from Midway, we will launch a properly coordinated strike against the American carriers." It was a decision born of prudence and tactical doctrine, but in war, prudence can be the deadliest virtue. On the hangar decks of all four carriers, the scene descended into barely controlled pandemonium. Ordnance crews worked with desperate efficiency, removing land attack bombs and replacing them with armor-piercing weapons and torpedoes. But the process was intricate and time-consuming. Heavy bombs and torpedoes had to be carefully handled, armed, and secured. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the deck. The discarded ordnance, rather than being properly stowed in armored magazines below, was hastily stacked on deck to save precious minutes. At 8:30, radar operators aboard the screening destroyers detected the first wave of American aircraft approaching from the northeast. Nagumo ordered combat air patrol fighters to intercept, and within minutes, the sky above the Japanese fleet erupted in aerial combat. Zeros dove and climbed in deadly spirals, their machine guns chattering as they engaged the first American attackers, obsolete torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet. The American Devastator torpedo bombers pressed their attack with suicidal courage, despite being slaughtered by Japanese fighters. Of 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one pilot would survive the day. But their sacrifice served a crucial purpose. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, clearing the sky for what was coming next. At 10:24, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led 33 dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise in a steep dive toward the Japanese carriers. The Zeros that might have intercepted them were busy at low altitude, finishing off the torpedo bombers. The Japanese lookouts, exhausted from tracking multiple attacks, were slow to spot the new threat descending from the sun. Nagumo was in his command center, reviewing reports from the first Midway strike when the first bomb struck Akagi. The explosion sent shock waves through the massive carrier's steel frame, but it was what happened next that sealed Japan's fate. The hastily stacked ordnance on the hangar deck detonated in a chain reaction of catastrophic proportions. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were burning wrecks. The decisive moment of the Pacific War had arrived not through careful planning or tactical brilliance, but through the confluence of split-second decisions and cruel chance. The admirals who had ignored every warning sign now watched their empire's naval supremacy disappear in towering columns of black smoke. The first American dive bomber screamed down toward Kaga at exactly 10:22 in the morning, its engine howling like a banshee as it plummeted through 3 miles of Pacific sky. On the carrier's bridge, Captain Jisaku Okada had barely enough time to shout, "Air raid!" before the 1,000-pound bomb struck his ship's flight deck with the force of concentrated lightning. The explosion tore through Kaga's wooden deck planking and detonated among the aircraft being rearmed in the hangar below. Within seconds, aviation gasoline ignited in a hellish inferno that raced through the ship's compartments. Fuel lines erupted like dragons breathing fire, and the bombs and torpedoes that had been carelessly stacked on deck added their own violent contributions to the growing conflagration. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Dick Best led his dive bomber section toward Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. The carrier's crew watched in horrified fascination as the American aircraft dove with mechanical precision, their pilots displaying a courage that bordered on madness. Best's bomb struck directly behind Akagi's island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft preparing for launch. The blast lifted entire aircraft into the air and slammed them against bulkheads like toys hurled by an angry child. Burning aviation fuel flowed across the hangar deck, creating rivers of fire that no damage control party could contain. Within minutes, Akagi, the pride of the Imperial Navy and symbol of Japanese naval aviation, had become a floating crematorium. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was recovering from appendicitis in Akagi's sick bay when the bombs struck. The explosion threw him from his bunk and sent him crawling through smoke-filled corridors toward the flight deck. What he found there defied comprehension. The orderly world of naval aviation had been replaced by scenes from Dante's Inferno. "The entire hangar deck was a sea of flames," Fuchida would later write. "Aircraft were exploding like firecrackers as their fuel tanks and ammunition cooked off. Men ran in all directions, some on fire, others trying desperately to fight flames that could not be fought." The elegant precision of the Japanese war machine had been reduced to primal chaos in less than 5 minutes. On Soryu, the third carrier to suffer catastrophe, Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto maintained his composure even as his ship died around him. 3 direct hits had shattered the carrier's flight deck and ignited massive fires below. Unlike his counterparts on Akagi and Kaga, Yamamoto refused to abandon ship, choosing instead to go down with his command in accordance with the ancient traditions of the Imperial Navy. The carnage was not limited to the carriers. Screening destroyers raced through the fleet formation, their crews throwing life preservers to sailors who had jumped from burning ships. The heavy cruiser Mikuma took bomb damage that would eventually prove fatal, while other vessels maneuvered frantically to avoid collisions with their crippled sisters. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, watching his dreams of victory transform into nightmarish reality. Staff officers urged him to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, but the admiral seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. The fleet that had seemed invincible at dawn was disintegrating before his eyes. Commander Genda, wounded by bomb fragments but still functioning, grabbed Nagumo by the shoulders. "Sir, we must transfer the flag immediately. Akagi cannot be saved." The ship's list was increasing as water poured through bomb holes below the waterline, and secondary explosions continued to rock the carrier's hull. As Nagumo was helped down into a destroyer's motor launch, he looked back at his burning flagship with the expression of a man witnessing the collapse of his world. The rising sun flag still flew from Akagi's mast, but it flew over a ship that would never again launch aircraft in anger. The backbone of Japanese naval aviation had been broken in 5 minutes of devastating American precision. Hiryu, the sole surviving fleet carrier, steamed northeast under Captain Tomei Okaku's command, her crew grimly determined to exact revenge for their fallen sisters. But even as they prepared their own strikes against the American carriers, every man aboard knew that the strategic balance of the Pacific War had shifted irrevocably. The signs that Japan's admirals had ignored were now written in fire and smoke across the morning sky, spelling the beginning of the end for the empire of the rising sun. Captain Tomeo Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, his jaw set in determination as he watched the funeral pyres of his sister ships stain the horizon. Of the 4 mighty fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, only his ship remained operational. The mathematics of naval warfare were brutally simple. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, 3 American carriers still fighting. The hunter had become the hunted, but the hunt was far from over. "Prepare immediate airstrike," Kaku commanded his air operations officer. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the first wave against Midway and returned with his fuel tank punctured by American gunfire, volunteered to lead the retaliatory attack despite knowing he lacked sufficient fuel for the return journey. It was a gesture that embodied the samurai spirit, death before dishonor, duty above survival. At 11:45, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from Hiryu's deck, their engines shrieking defiance as they climbed toward the American task force. Tomonaga's aircraft carried a makeshift white banner bearing the rising sun, a battle flag that would guide them to glory or death. The pilot transmitted a final message to his carrier: "We will strike the enemy and return victorious or not at all." Meanwhile, aboard the American carrier Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher watched his radar screens with growing concern. The Japanese were coming, and they were coming with the desperate fury of cornered warriors. Fletcher's ship had already survived 1 major battle at the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, and her hastily repaired hull bore scars that would have sent any other vessel to dry dock. The Imperial Japanese Navy's doctrine of offensive action at all costs now manifested itself in pure form. Tomonaga's aircraft approached Yorktown with textbook precision, diving through curtains of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with lethal black puffs. The Americans had learned to respect Japanese naval aviation at Pearl Harbor, and during 6 months of Pacific combat, these pilots were skilled, disciplined, and absolutely fearless in their dedication to the Emperor. At 12:10, the first Japanese bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating deep into the carrier's hull before exploding among aviation fuel lines. The blast killed dozens of sailors instantly and started fires that threatened to consume the ship from within. A second bomb followed, then a third, each explosion adding to the growing conflagration that transformed the American carrier into a floating inferno remarkably similar to her Japanese counterparts. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered damage control parties to flood magazines and establish fire breaks, but the situation appeared hopeless. Within an hour, Yorktown was dead in the water, her flight deck twisted into scrap metal and her hangar deck filled with toxic smoke. The Japanese had drawn blood, proving that American carriers were just as vulnerable as their own when caught by skilled pilots with the element of surprise. But Tomonaga's victory came at a terrible price. Of the 18 dive bombers that had left Hiryu, only 5 returned. The lieutenant himself disappeared into the vast Pacific, his final radio transmission a simple banzai as his fuel ran out somewhere between the burning American carrier and his home ship. The cream of Japanese naval aviation was being consumed in a fire of its own making. Historical records from the National World War II Museum document that over the next 2 days, the U.S. troops at sea and on Midway continued their attacks, forcing the Japanese to abandon the battle and retreat. By mid-afternoon, Hiryu herself faced the inevitable. American dive bombers from Enterprise, redirected from their original targets, found the last Japanese carrier steaming desperately northward. Captain Kaku ordered evasive maneuvers, but his ship could not escape the same fate that had befallen her sisters. 4 direct hits in rapid succession turned Hiryu into yet another floating crematorium. As flames consumed his ship, Kaku made the same decision as Captain Yamamoto on Soryu. He would go down with his command. Engine room personnel flooded the magazines to prevent catastrophic explosions. but there was no saving the carrier. By evening, Hiryu was listing heavily to starboard, her flight deck awash and her battle flag still flying in defiant futility. The last great carrier action of the day ended as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the backbone of the combined fleet, lay burning or sinking in the Central Pacific. Their loss represented more than ships and planes. It marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy and the beginning of America's inexorable march toward Tokyo Bay. The admirals who had dismissed every warning sign now faced the consequences of their arrogance in the most brutal terms imaginable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the catastrophic news aboard his flagship Yamato at 4:30 in the afternoon, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he read the damage reports. 4 fleet carriers lost, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots dead or missing. The most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by Japan had been annihilated in a single morning. The architect of Pearl Harbor stared at the radio message in stunned silence, fully comprehending that his grand strategy had not merely failed, it had backfired with devastating consequences. "Sir, Admiral Nagumo requests instructions," his communications officer reported with carefully controlled emotion. The staff officers assembled in Yamato's command center maintained their professional composure, but the shock was evident in their faces. These were men who had planned and executed victories across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. They had never contemplated the possibility of such complete and utter defeat. Captain Kamedo Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior operations officer, spread charts across the plotting table with mechanical precision. His calculations were grimly simple. Without air cover, the invasion of Midway was impossible. Without carrier-based fighters, the combined fleet's battleships and cruisers were sitting targets for American land-based bombers. The entire operation had to be abandoned immediately. "We must withdraw all forces at once," Kuroshima advised, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Americans will undoubtedly pursue with everything they have. Our surface ships cannot survive daylight operations in these waters without air cover." The admission hung in the air like incense at a funeral. The Imperial Navy, master of the Pacific for 6 months, was now forced to flee in broad daylight. Yamamoto walked to the bridge windows and gazed out at his fleet. Mighty Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, rode the swells in majestic splendor. Her escort of cruisers and destroyers maintained perfect formation, their crews undoubtedly confused by the sudden order to reverse course and retire westward. They had steamed toward Midway, expecting victory and glory. Now they were running for their lives. The weight of strategic failure pressed down on Yamamoto's shoulders like a physical burden. He had conceived the Midway operation as a decisive stroke that would force America to negotiate a favorable peace. Instead, he had handed the Americans their greatest naval victory since the War of 1812. The carefully constructed facade of Japanese invincibility had been shattered in 5 minutes of American dive bombing. At 6:15 that evening, the final act of the tragedy played out as Hiryu's crew prepared to abandon their doomed carrier. Captain Kaku had already made his decision to go down with the ship, but he ordered his surviving officers and men to transfer to escorting destroyers. The carrier's battle ensign was ceremonially lowered and presented to the captain, who would carry it with him into the depths of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Kazagumo, maneuvered alongside the burning carrier to take off survivors. The scene that greeted him defied description. Men with terrible burns, others suffering from smoke inhalation, all of them bearing the psychological trauma of witnessing their mighty ships reduced to floating scrap metal in minutes. The pilots who returned from the strikes against American carriers spoke little, Hara would later recall. Their eyes held the hollow look of men who had seen too much death in too short a time. Many were the finest aviators in the Imperial Navy, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean campaigns. To see them broken by defeat was perhaps more shocking than the loss of the carriers themselves. As darkness fell over the Pacific, destroyer Isokaze fired torpedoes into Hiryu's hull to prevent her capture by advancing American forces. The last of the Pearl Harbor strike force slipped beneath the waves at 9:23, taking with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy. The rising sun flag that had flown triumphantly from her mast now rested on the ocean floor, 4 miles beneath the surface. The retreat westward continued through the night, but the psychological damage was irreversible. Radio intercepts indicated that American submarines were already moving to intercept the withdrawing Japanese forces. Every shadow on the horizon might conceal enemy aircraft. The hunters of 6 months had become the hunted, and they did not like the sensation. Yamamoto stood alone on Yamato's bridge through the long hours of darkness, contemplating the magnitude of his miscalculation. The warning signs had been there. American code-breaking capabilities, unusual enemy ship movements, intelligence reports that suggested foreknowledge of Japanese plans. But he had dismissed them all, blinded by previous victories and convinced of his own tactical genius. Now the bill had come due, and the price was higher than anyone had imagined. The sun rose on June 5, 1942, over a Pacific Ocean transformed. Where once the rising sun flag had flown supreme from the masts of 4 mighty aircraft carriers, now only oil slicks and floating debris marked the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the bridge of his headquarters ship, reading damage assessments that would reshape the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War. American losses had been significant but manageable. The carrier Yorktown, crippled by Japanese bombs and torpedoes, would eventually sink after repeated submarine attacks. 150 American aircraft had been lost, and 307 sailors and airmen would not return to their families. But these casualties paled in comparison to the devastation inflicted upon the Imperial Navy. According to official records from the U.S. Naval Institute, approximately 3,057 Japanese personnel were killed during the battle, representing an irreplaceable loss of experienced naval aviation personnel. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, found himself clinging to a destroyer's life raft as Akagi's survivors were pulled from the oil-stained waters. The man who had symbolized Japanese naval aviation supremacy was now just another casualty statistic. His appendix surgery scar torn open by bomb fragments, his uniform soaked with seawater and fuel oil. "I watched our beautiful carriers burn," Fuchida later wrote in his memoirs. Ships that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor were reduced to twisted metal and smoke in minutes. The pilots we had trained for years, the aircraft we had perfected through countless exercises, all gone. It was as if the gods themselves had turned against us. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japan's carrier construction program could not replace 4 fleet carriers quickly enough to maintain offensive momentum in the Pacific. More critically, the loss of experienced pilots, men who had trained for years and possessed irreplaceable combat experience, created a gap that could never be filled. Japanese naval aviation would continue fighting for 3 more years, but it would never again achieve the devastating effectiveness displayed at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto's staff officers worked through the night, calculating the new balance of forces in the Pacific. Their conclusions were uniformly grim. The combined fleet still possessed powerful battleships and cruisers, but without carrier air cover, these surface ships were vulnerable to land-based bombers and enemy carriers. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted permanently to the United States. Commander Mitsuru Yoshida, serving aboard the cruiser Chikuma, recorded his observations of the retreating fleet. The formation that had steamed eastward with such confidence now limped homeward like wounded animals. Officers who had spoken boldly of victory now studied their charts with worried expressions. The atmosphere throughout the fleet had changed from triumphant anticipation to grim determination to survive the voyage home. The human cost extended beyond mere statistics. In the waters around Midway, hundreds of Japanese sailors clung to life rafts and debris, waiting for rescue that might never come. American ships moved cautiously through the area, picking up survivors when possible. But the vast Pacific swallowed many men without trace. Families in Japan would receive formal notifications months later. Died gloriously in service to the emperor. But the reality was far less glorious. Young men drowning in the dark waters of the Central Pacific, victims of their leaders' strategic miscalculations. By June 7th, the last Japanese ships had withdrawn beyond the range of American land-based aircraft from Midway. The atoll remained in American hands, its runways scarred but operational, its defenders battered but victorious. The strategic objectives that had justified the entire operation, drawing out and destroying the American Pacific Fleet, had been achieved in reverse. Japan had been drawn out and destroyed instead. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Initial reports had been deliberately optimistic, claiming heavy American losses and successful attacks on enemy positions. But as the truth gradually emerged through survivor accounts and reconnaissance reports, the full scope of the defeat became undeniable. The Empire of the Rising Sun had suffered its first major naval defeat since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster through carefully worded briefings, reportedly remained silent for several minutes before asking a single question. How many carriers do we have left? The answer, 2 fleet carriers and several smaller vessels, revealed the true strategic situation. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been gutted in 4 days of combat. The admirals who had ignored every warning sign now faced the consequences of their arrogance. The intelligence reports suggesting American foreknowledge, the unusual enemy ship movements, the radio intercepts indicating heightened American activity, all had been dismissed as inconsequential. The price of that hubris was measured in sunken carriers, lost aircraft, and thousands of dead sailors floating in the Pacific swells. 3 months after the Battle of Midway, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, reviewing intelligence reports that confirmed his worst fears. American industrial capacity was beginning to show its true strength. New Essex-class aircraft carriers were sliding down the ways at an unprecedented rate, while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace even a fraction of their losses. The strategic balance that had seemed so favorable after Pearl Harbor had shifted irrevocably against the Empire of the Rising Sun. The psychological impact of Midway rippled throughout the Imperial Navy like shock waves from an underwater explosion. Officers who had once spoken confidently of bringing the Americans to their knees now whispered doubts in quiet corners of wardrooms. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of stunning victories, had been shattered by 5 minutes of American dive bombing on the morning of June 4th. Captain Kameto Kuroshima entered Yamamoto's cabin carrying the latest casualty reports from naval aviation training units. The numbers told a story of institutional collapse that went far beyond the immediate tactical defeat at Midway. Japan's pre-war pilot training program had emphasized quality over quantity, producing superbly skilled aviators through intensive, time-consuming instruction. But replacing the experienced pilots lost at Midway required shortcuts that compromised training standards. "Sir, our new pilots are graduating with half the flight hours of their predecessors," Kuroshima reported grimly. "They lack the expertise for carrier operations and the combat experience to survive contact with American fighters. We are sending boys to do the work of veterans." The cruel mathematics of attrition warfare were already becoming apparent. Japan could not replace quality with quantity fast enough to maintain competitive effectiveness. Meanwhile, in the Central Pacific, American forces were moving with the confidence of predators scenting wounded prey. The amphibious assault on Guadalcanal in August 1942 marked the beginning of the American offensive that would eventually reach Japan itself. Admiral Nimitz had transformed a defensive strategy into an aggressive campaign of island hopping that brought American airfields ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The Japanese response revealed the extent to which Midway had damaged their strategic flexibility. Operations that would have been launched immediately after Pearl Harbor now required careful consideration of available forces. Every carrier, every experienced pilot, every modern aircraft had become precious resources that could not be squandered. The Imperial Navy found itself fighting a defensive war for which its doctrine, training, and cultural traditions had not prepared it. By October 1942, the carrier Shokaku, one of the few fleet carriers to survive Midway, limped back to port after suffering severe damage during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Her flight deck was twisted wreckage, her hangar bays flooded with seawater, her air group decimated by American fighters. The sight of the once proud carrier being towed into harbor by tugboats provided a stark visual reminder of how far Japanese fortunes had fallen. Naval historians at the National World War II Museum note that the Japanese lost approximately 3,057 men during the Battle of Midway, representing an irreplaceable loss of experienced naval aviation personnel that would handicap Japanese operations for the remainder of the war. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Midway, found himself reassigned to shore duty in the Northern Pacific. The man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and overseen the destruction of the Pacific Fleet's battleships was now relegated to commanding land-based installations that played no role in the decisive carrier battles of the Pacific War. His career, like his ships, had been sunk at Midway. The final irony of the Midway disaster became apparent as American codebreakers continued their work throughout 1942 and beyond. The same intelligence capabilities that had provided Admiral Nimitz with advance warning of Japanese plans continued to give American forces critical advantages in subsequent battles. Japan's admirals had ignored not just the tactical signs pointing toward defeat at Midway, but the strategic reality that their communications had been compromised from the beginning. On April 18, 1943, Admiral Yamamoto himself paid the ultimate price for his strategic miscalculations. American P-38 fighters, guided by intercepted radio messages revealing his inspection tour of forward bases, shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation died in the jungle, his body riddled with machine gun bullets, his dreams of negotiated peace buried with him in the Solomon Islands mud. As 1943 turned into 1944, the industrial might that American strategists had always counted upon began to manifest itself in overwhelming numbers. New carriers, modern aircraft, and well-trained pilots flowed into the Pacific theater in quantities that dwarfed Japanese replacement capabilities. The strategic initiative that Japan had seized at Pearl Harbor and lost at Midway would never return to the rising sun. The Battle of Midway had lasted 4 days, but its consequences echoed throughout the remaining years of the Pacific War. Every subsequent Japanese defeat could trace its origins back to that morning when Admiral Nagumo hesitated, when American dive bombers found 4 aircraft carriers with their guard down, when the signs of impending disaster that had been visible to any careful observer finally materialized in the form of exploding flight decks and burning hangar bays. The admirals who had ignored those signs paid with their careers, their ships, and ultimately their lives. But the real price was paid by the thousands of young Japanese sailors and airmen who died in a war that could have ended differently if their leaders had possessed the wisdom to read the warnings written in intercepted radio messages and reconnaissance reports. The Pacific became their graveyard, and Midway marked the beginning of their long march toward defeat.